Welcome to Issued for Construction. I'm your host, Jonathan Jacobs. Today I've got with me a gentleman from out west in Canada. While he might be out west, his projects are actually kind of all over the world. He's got a lot in the western part of Canada, but they're everywhere. And he's just been everywhere. Today I've got with me Michael Leckie of Leckie Studio. Michael, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Jonathan. Happy to be here.
And so I've followed Michael's work for over 8 years. There's a long list of awards that have been won both recently and over the tenure of your practice, which I will define through the description of this episode. So if you wanted to go check that out, I'm going to have everything there because there's a long list of accreditation and wins that have flown through this incredible studio with you at the helm. And before we get into what it takes to operate at that level, I want to take just a moment to talk about the partners who help bring these incredible award-winning spaces to life. Because when you design and build a home, you're ultimately creating the backdrop for where people spend time with their family and friends. It's exactly why the team at Kaplan's Appliances understands so well. They have a deep admiration for the design and build community, and they treat their relationships with industry professionals and clients like true friendships, built on a foundation of respect. Kaplan's knows that a kitchen needs to be as functional as it is beautiful. Whether you are a designer specifying a panel-ready Sub-Zero fridge or a Fisher-Paykel dishwasher to blend seamlessly into the cabinetry, or a homeowner looking for that statement custom range from Jenn-Air or La Cornue, they have you covered. They even have those stunning Sub-Zero wine fridges where you can look inside and truly appreciate your collection. Because at the end of the day, it's all about how you use the space. It's about gathering around the kitchen island, cooking a great meal, cracking open a bottle of wine or a cold non-alcoholic beer, and just enjoying the people you care about. To find the products that speak to how you actually want to live, visit Kaplan's Appliances. You can access their website in the liner notes, or you can email me. It's Jonathan, Jonathan, at issuedforconstruction.ca. So with that said, I congratulations on that, because I think it's got to be very validating to be able to travel somewhere, and then also while you're going to defend or to present a project, it's got to be nice to have it worthwhile when you can actually win in the category.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you for the kind words. The awards are kind of a funny thing. On the one hand, I think there is a form of validation that comes from them. I guess I see it as a trajectory. And so when you win local awards and then you start winning national awards and then you start winning international awards, it's somehow affirming that there's, it's hard to say. There's some kind of external validation for the work, which is not really the thing that we're seeking or the thing that we're after. But, if I were to speak honestly and candidly, sometimes the work feels terrifying. And I understand that we exist kind of in the margins, not only because the practice is on the West Coast out in the Pacific Northwest, and it feels like we're remote, and a lot of our work happens in remote locations, but also culturally, I think we're sort of in a niche, at the periphery of practice. And so, it happens less so, but it used to happen more, earlier in my career. And it does still happen. I would wake up in the middle of the night and think like, is this project, does it have any merit? I mean, are we kidding ourselves? Is it, the minute you sort of step outside the norms or have the ambition to do things that aren't entirely normative, I think, there's a risk associated with them. And so in some ways, maybe it just helps us to strengthen the confidence of the voice of the practice in some ways. And I think it's really validating for the clients, and the team. The clients, it's interesting. I get messages from clients and I think they do, appreciate the fact that their projects are recognized. The value proposition of an architect, particularly in the custom single family home realm is kind of a almost preposterous one. You say to someone, hey, we're going to take all the money you have and all the money you can possibly borrow, And I know you just met me, but trust me, it's going to be great. Which is a funny relationship in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, how much background information do people try to stir up on like their financial advisor and understand, what are the other people what's the wealth of the other people you're looking at, what's the size of your portfolio, all that kind of stuff, right? And
Yeah.
yet here you are, and you're about to go make one of the biggest investments you can possibly make.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And every sector of work is a little bit different in that regard. The more personal it is,
Yeah,
I think the more personal it is in some ways, the more opportunity that there is. And some of our best projects in the custom residential realm have come through, getting to know the clients really well. And what I'm really excited about is having the opportunity to work with clients across a long span of time through multiple projects.
right.
That's a real honor, and a testament, I guess, to the fact that they feel it's going well. And there's a form of intimacy, I think, that comes through that relationship, and that relationship is really, really paramount
Yeah.
to not only the success of the project, but even just the terms of the project. I think that it's challenging to exceed the aspiration of the client. Like, we're always pushing, but you can only push so far beyond perhaps the aspiration of the client, because
Yeah.
especially in that type of work, at some point the client will just turn to you and say, like, this is great, all this architect speak and everything that you're talking about, but I really I want a nice house. You hired me, I hired you to design me a nice house. And so there can be at times a little bit of tension there. And fundamentally, there's just so much trust that really needs to happen. And I think there's the tension between the architect's and the practice's body of work, and the client's goals. And we first and foremost, I think, really look for the one singular opportunity that exists in every project. And I always say this: it exists at the confluence of the client's program, the site, and all of the various dimensions of the site, and the client's aspirations, and obviously the budget, is a huge variable in that. And at the confluence of those forces, we try to find something that can be extraordinary and that we can really push as far as we possibly can. And when you find that thing and it's aligned with the client's goals and aspirations, I think, there's the potential to do amazing things.
So I want to talk to you about something you said, and that is getting to know your clients. I want to have people kind of get to know you and what it was like for you kind of growing up. What was it like for you? Where did you grow up, and what area?
I grew up in Toronto, sort of on the edge of North Toronto, North York,
Okay.
kind of near Avenue Road in Wilson.
Not all that far from where I am.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, we were
Okay.
talking about that.
So what was it like growing up? Were you a creative kid? Did you have ambition? Were you reserved? Were you into sports? What were you like as a kid?
I would say, I've always been an introvert, and
Okay.
some people find that curious or puzzling. But as a kid, I was really fascinated, and I remember this at such a young age, with just the way things go together. I would sit down, whether it was in the forest or in the playground or at home, and I would just stack things. And there was something about the way they would be stacked, whether it was sticks or blocks. And I was just fascinated with the finding something poetic about the way things would be organized. And my aunt would say that I said I wanted to be an architect at a very young age. I mean, probably long before I knew what architecture was. Absolutely long before I knew anything about architecture. But I spent a lot of time drawing as a child.
What were you drawing?
I would draw all kinds of things. I mean, I think when you're really small, you start by tracing things, and
Yep.
drawing the things that you're drawn to, in books and things like that. And then I would get these drawing books and I would draw figures. But I think what I really loved drawing was actually architecture. I would draw, like, not homes, but like hideouts, or, things like that. And I remember reading books. The books that I was most drawn to as a child in elementary school were the books that would, describe things like the pyramids or a castle, and they would have these incredible illustrations and cutaways and thousands of people, milling about, and they would explain the relationship between, the activity that was going on, and let's say even the culture of what was happening and the structure. I mean, those were the books that I was obsessed with, and so I think naturally that influenced my kind of drawing, and I think that was ultimately a big part of what really brought me towards architecture.
Did you
And
did you have a subscription to anything like National Geographic or
I had a subscription to, I think, things like Owl magazine,
Owl? Yeah, okay.
and I think before that maybe even Highlights magazine, and those were instrumental because I think they were activities, and you had this, you developed this curiosity, particularly Owl, because it fostered a curiosity of the natural world. And I was, a kind of urban slash suburban kid.
Yeah.
It's funny when I think back, I've never actually been camping with my parents, or spent any time in the outdoors. And, like
With them or on your own?
with them.
Or with them. Okay, yeah.
And I could count the number of times that I've gone hiking with them, on one hand. And yet I'm a person who loves the outdoors, the wilderness, spends so much time there, and really seeks out remote places and being in nature. And so I think maybe a lot of that came from like those early experiences. Owl, National Geographic, we didn't have a subscription, but my grandfather did.
Okay.
And so I remember being at his house, and there was, a bookshelf or bookshelves full of National Geographics. And so, I think growing up in the '70s and in the '80s, there was like a phenomena of sort of boredom, that, was a thing. And so you would just make do with what was around you, and you would engage in that realm. These days, kids, and my daughter's 18, she's just left for university, this idea of boredom, because they've had this device in their pocket.
Yeah.
It's a very different youth in many ways. So, as much as I've tried to create a very intentional environment for Nova, and, one that is full of wonder and sparks curiosity, and is full of interest in learning and is rich, the kids are so preoccupied with
Yes.
their phones, and at its best, it's a social instrument for them to connect. And it seems funny to think that as kids, and when I was in high school or elementary school, you make a plan to meet someone there, like hours or days in advance, and you just go and expect that they would be there.
100%. And if they're running late, you didn't know why, you're just standing there waiting, wondering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you would just get on with it. And then,
Yeah.
if they didn't show up, you might go and find them. And, it was just the connected world is such a vastly different place. But, back to your question, it was a very much a sort of, middle class existence in Toronto. I mean, I was very fortunate in some ways, because we were members of a tennis club.
Yep.
And I spent a lot of time there. I think that was like the one big, investment, as my parents talk about it. We didn't really travel that much or take many vacations, but this was the one thing that they were invested in. And for me, it was an amazing opportunity, for socializing, but also for playing things like tennis and squash. And squash was a really big part of my life.
Squash was not tennis.
Squash, yeah. I used to play competitive squash through high school and through university.
Okay.
And I traveled a lot. And in some ways, it was related to the path that I chose and the decision around school and university, and why I started relatively a slightly later path in my architectural education.
So, and the other big thing with squash, you have the physical element of it, which is, I think, something that you probably would have enjoyed, but given what you said about loving to be outdoors and the physicality of that, but also the mental fortitude to be able to find solutions to these problems when you're down in a game or in the match, and you got to figure out how you're going to come back.
Absolutely. I mean, and I would say that's true of virtually any sport. Cultivating this idea of mental toughness. Squash is a funny game because in many ways it's one-on-one.
Yeah, that's what I was going to allude to. It's not like other sports.
No, and in some ways it's the perfect sport for an introvert because it's a very polite sport in ways. Like there's no body contact. You have to really clear the path.
Well, you're also in a cage.
Yeah, in this very small space. So it's oddly passive aggressive in some ways too, because you're trying to physically exhaust your opponent by making them run from corner to corner, while they're trying to do the same. But the sort of mental toughness piece, it is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about because, of course, when I used to train and go to training camps at 14, 15, we were in these mental toughness clinics and we were being trained that way. And it is something that I think has served me really well throughout, so much of my life to shake off a setback. And that idea that when something doesn't go your way, you don't dwell on it. You just, you say, what did I learn here? And I move forward instantly in the moment.
Yeah.
And the ability to deal with, I would say triumph and loss. Because it's an incredibly personal thing. It's not like a team sport where you have this camaraderie and you all win or you all lose. And, sure, everybody has great moments and low moments. When you lose a match in squash or you lose in the finals of a big tournament, I mean, you don't have anywhere else to look.
Inward.
And similarly, when you win, and in some ways, I think they're an amazing series of life lessons and things that have come from that I'm incredibly grateful for, and it really shapes, I think, the way, you approach the world. It probably relates to the fact that my father, when I was 16, gave me Rudyard Kipling's If, like a framed antique copy of Rudyard Kipling's If. And it's, in fact, I've got it sitting here right above my monitor. And, it's something that has, I think, resonated with me quite profoundly, from that age. So let's say over the last 35 years.
Listening to Michael talk about his early experiences shaped the way he approaches the world perfectly sets the stage for how he frames the physical world in his architecture. Coming up later in our conversation, you're going to hear Michael and I touch on the Lantern House and the incredible importance of bringing natural light into a space through strategic windows and massive skylights. When you want to achieve that kind of expansive glass in your builds, you need to be working with the window and door company that gets it. And for me, it's the Doors. They specialize in European aluminum products imported directly from Poland, working closely with world-class manufacturers like Rayner's, Aluprof, and Schuko. They provide true slim profiles that completely maximize your view without compromising on performance. You are getting incredible R values and top-tier thermal breaks available in both double and triple pane glass. If your project calls for stunning lift and slides or massive curtain walls up to 20 feet tall or 20 feet wide, this is exactly what they thrive at providing. And they do it all at a price point that truly makes sense for exceptional quality you receive. What really sets the Door apart is the dedication to the process and their ability to adapt. They actually have a specialized machine right here in their Toronto shop that allows them to cut aluminum locally. If you ever face a tight timeline or a sudden issue on site, they can step in and make sure that the things work without the typical overseas delays. And while they are based in Toronto, their reach is vast. They handle installations all across North America, stretching right into the Bahamas and the Caribbean. Owners Martin and Marta are constantly evaluating their business to ensure your mind is at ease. It is completely normal to find Martin working on a Saturday, traveling around the city to measure sites or checking in on his installation crews both locally and abroad. They have absolutely no problem satisfying the strict demands of architects, designers, builders, and homeowners alike. They are entirely dedicated to ensuring your product is delivered and installed on schedule and on budget. To learn more about how they can elevate your next build, head over to the liner notes of this episode for their details, or you can email me directly. It's Jonathan, Jonathan, at issued4construction.ca. Now, getting back to my conversation with Michael, I want to ask him about the drills he used to run on the court. Did you ever, they're no longer called this, but did you ever have to run suicides, like line to line?
Absolutely. Spent a lot of time running suicides. We used to run star drills corner to corner.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's also a kind of interesting camaraderie that you form, with
The other
your
students.
fellow competitors.
Yeah.
You're friends with them, you're great friends with them, and then you step on the court and you're trying to grind them to dust. And so that's a really fascinating thing. I realized that, this extreme mental toughness that I had developed, and I was the kind of player that, I loved it when the stakes got really high. I still
Right.
do, when it was back in the day, you played to 15 points in hardball squash, and it would be 3 out of 5 games, and it would be 2-all, 14-all in the 5th game. Everything was riding on this point. I lived for that, and I loved that. And I came to realize, like, not everyone's built that way. Many of my friends would be like, "Oh my God, don't hit the ball." I don't want to be here right now. Whereas I came to really, really love that. And I talked to friends about this, that those things that serve you well in those moments, like, it took me a long time to realize that in my personal life, that actually, like, I had to make adjustments, because in interpersonal dynamics, you could get into this mode of, like, this fight or flight
Yeah.
scenario, and just turn, like, entirely
Into the dog.
yeah, like, kind of mentally ruthless.
Yeah.
And which is really not a great thing in relationships. And so to be able to down calibrate, that sort of mental toughness, and then really understand, like, where it's appropriate to apply it in your life, certainly not universally, and develop a kind of discretion. It really, I will say, like, it's taken me a long time. And it's a big part of the work that I've been doing personally for the last 10 or 15 years.
Okay. Well, and we're going to get to these 10, 15 years. So what did it look like for you when you got into high school? You're playing competitive squash as a part of your life. But at this point, were you now starting to focus on elements of school that related to the profession you wanted to seek out? Or were you still uncertain in high school of where you wanted to go and what you wanted to study?
My high school was had a very traditional curriculum.
Okay.
And so I went to the University of Toronto schools. And so I would ride the subway every day from the time I was 11 years old until I graduated at 17. 17, yeah, I graduated at 17 and turned 18 right after I graduated.
Yeah.
And it was, about an hour bus, subway, downtown. And so that, I think, had a provided a certain amount of independence, at that early age. And that high school, I remember, was challenging. It was overwhelming at first. I think I suffered from a little bit of anxiety as a kid, and I would find it kind of overwhelming going all the way down there by myself and being in that environment, and really had to sort of learn to cope with that. But the curriculum was quite traditional. There were the languages: French, Spanish, German. We took Latin.
Oh, yeah, German, really?
Yeah. I didn't take German. I took Latin,
Yeah.
Spanish. They had this great course called Romance of Antiquities, which was about the classical world, which I thought was fascinating, because there was a lot of, if not architecture adjacent discourse and subject matter.
Okay.
Then it was, the various maths, English, geography, philosophy, which was one of my favorite courses. And is a subject that I continued to study through my undergrad, and then I continue to explore today.
Okay.
And so and art and music. But we didn't have any of the, the sort of more hands-on skills. Like there was no woodworking, there was no shop class. And these were things that I would have been incredibly interested in and curious about, because I loved to make things with my hands.
Well, you had the other art class you just referenced in on the periphery.
Yeah, exactly. And so
They had to decide, where were they going to invest, in physical books or in tools and lathes, other such things.
Yeah. And it was a great education. I mean, it was challenging at the time. It was I think an accelerated program. At that school at that time, everybody collectively would skip one grade. So they did grade 7 and 8 in 1 year, and then you go straight into grade 9.
Wow.
And so, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have gone there. And because at that time it was a school that was funded by the University of Toronto, and the tuition was incredibly low. So they would have, thousands and thousands and thousands of kids from all over the city writing the entrance exams, because it was the one sort of accessible private school. And as a result, what was fascinating about this school is that it was a melting pot of kids from all over the city,
Yeah.
from all different walks of life, from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so you don't necessarily have that awareness at that age, but I'm very grateful to have spent those formative years in that environment. But there was nothing, that was, I think, interesting to me in the way that I was interested in ultimately what I would understand architecture to be. I remember I was fortunate to go on a student exchange to Madrid. I lived in Spain for half of my grade 12 year, which would have been, my junior year in high school or second last year in high school.
Unbelievable. What an experience that must have been.
Oh, it was phenomenal. And actually it was really transformational because I was a relatively, I think, shy and introverted kid. And people told me that I came back from that experience and was like a whole different person. And I remember, taking Spanish for 2 years and then getting off the plane in Madrid. And I just come from the US National Squash Championships, flew to Madrid, and I was there a little bit late. So I'd missed the orientation with, I think there were a dozen or so or more kids that were coming from Canada as part of this exchange program. So I just went in cold, and my exchange family's mother picked me up at the airport, and she didn't speak a word of English. And I was just like, wow, okay, I am in it.
Here we go.
Here we go. Exactly. And was able to navigate that. And it was an incredible experience. But the one thing I remember so profoundly is, I was able to take a drafting course
In Spain.
in
In grade 12.
in grade 12. And that was the only thing that I would say, perhaps aside from art or philosophy, this was like very directly related to what I knew was a core passion. And I was in heaven. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And, I did all the exercises and extra exercises, and I loved it.
Just to
for
be
me, it
clear,
was such an obvious indicator.
drafting at this point is not drafting on a computer.
No, this was hand drafting.
Yes.
So,
sure.
it was perspective drawing. A lot of it was drawing axonometric and perspective images from floor plans and elevations and, objects, complex objects, simple objects, construction lines. And I loved it so much.
What was the biggest challenge you had with drawing at the time, with drafting in general, that the teacher told you they needed to work on?
Oh gosh, I really, I was just so filled with joy. I honestly couldn't tell you. I can't remember.
Okay.
It was the only, art class was, there were so many media that we were exploring, sculpture, painting, everything else. But I remember sitting there and being like, I'm at school and I get to draw. This is part of the curriculum. This is part of the education. I show up and I draw. And for me, that was everything. It was so fantastic.
What was the best meal that you had with the family you stayed with? Do you remember?
Well, it was the most memorable meal.
Yeah.
The father would cook a paella, and it would be, he would cook it for like a full day and a half in a huge traditional, wide, low sort of pan. And that was certainly the most memorable dish. Probably also because it was the only dish that he would cook, and everyone in the family would get so excited. And we lived right in the center of Madrid. And so, yeah, there were just so many, life mind expanding experiences there.
Were there other kids on this trip that were from outside of Canada that were a part of an exchange program, or is it only from the Canadian school?
As far as I knew, in this program, it was just Canadian students. And I think there were maybe 12, 18 students, but I was the only student in this program at the school that I was going to.
Okay.
And so, it wasn't like there were other, exchange students that I would hang out with, at lunch or before and after school. It was just like I was there with my exchange partner. and then the friends that we met.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. What an experience.
It was an amazing experience, and I came back just, my horizons had been expanded. Prior to that, I think I had only left North America once, and so that was yeah, it was such a pivotal year for me.
What was it? Well, one other question on this. Was it coincidental that you had taken Spanish for 2 years and then went on this trip, or was it in some ways a plan of yours?
I took Spanish because I think we were encouraged to take a language,
Yeah.
and Spanish seemed more exotic than French at that time, and I transitioned over. And then as I took it, I could see the opportunity. We always had, two or three exchange students at our school at the time, and I thought, wow, this feels like an amazing adventure. And so I applied and was fortunate to have been accepted.
Okay.
It's great.
And so you came back, as you say, you were slightly changed from this experience.
I came back and I should also say at that time, because I was traveling around playing squash, I was having these other experiences around that time too, where I would drive with a coach or with a van full of kids, or eventually fly by myself down to, the States. And, usually the big tournaments were all held at Ivy League colleges back then. So fly down to Yale or Princeton, to Dartmouth, and play in these big, junior tournaments, University of Pennsylvania, and these, really impressive
I
facilities.
was going to say, well, these are world-class facilities.
Yeah, yeah. And those campuses had world-class architecture too.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember just, looking at the Yale campus at the con work, and not have any idea of the context or, who Con was, but just like being in those buildings and like spending time navigating that landscape. It was amazing. And it was also a crazy experience because it makes me think of the movie Superbad. Like I would be like 16 years old going to frat parties, and just like having that kind of experience. And it was hilarious. And so I would come back, after these weekends, and was having this like entire parallel experience to my everyday, school experience. And I would come back, and it was like, I would try and explain like the weekend that I'd had about going to a whole bunch of frat parties and, playing all these squash matches and having won this tournament, and, then be like, okay, back to geography.
Yeah. Well, you weren't here for the group project, Michael. Okay.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, we met yesterday at 10 a.m. and we had to finish it off.
Yeah. And so for me, like squash, I think at that time was like a real opportunity for life experience.
Yeah.
And to play and to travel and to meet people and have these kind of amazing experience. I mean, so many people in the squash community at the higher levels, especially, guys that were older than me that, took me under their wing at various stages of life. I mean, so many of them were lunatics. And, there's something that I think is commonly understood about people that are performing at an exceptionally high level, that, people would say this about so many world-class athletes, Tiger Woods, and the psychology of performing at a high level, and kind of like how that perhaps creates imbalance in other aspects of your life. And so a lot of the people that I was spending time with were, Canadian American, guys from Mexico, like, high performing international players. And a lot of them were lunatics. And so they were my mentors.
Great way to describe them.
Yeah. And I should say I also was very fortunate to have amazing mentorship as well. Pat Richardson, who was a legendary Canadian squash professional player and teaching professional, ran the program at the Toronto Cricket Club, where I grew up playing. And he joined there probably when I was, I think, 11 years old. And so he was my coach all through my teens, and remains a really close friend of mine today. Like our relationship has kind of shifted and morphed, and I'm so grateful for the lifelong mentorship that I have had. I mean, I absolutely wouldn't put him in the category of lunatic, He certainly has his own eccentricities, but I think a really good coach will take, any small moment and contextualize it into having meaning,
Yep.
into why you would or would not do something, and what that means, to behave or to act a certain way, or when something happens, like, how you interpret that and how
Yeah.
you internalize it and how you move forward with that. And so, that's something that I've always been incredibly grateful for.
I grew up playing tennis my whole life,
Okay.
and I had a Bayesian coach who, and some of his other coaches, like I was another guy from Barbados, another guy from Jamaica, and like it was tough in that program. And I eventually left and became a coach myself as I got older, and I coached tennis to on and off through high school, university, and then professionally afterwards for a total of about 13, 14 years. And so, to the point that you just made about trying to provide some level of context to what you're going through in a small micro moments, I used to do a lot of that with students, and so it's interesting to hear the perspective that you have on it. And I've like have these recollections of sitting with someone on the side of a court and walking them through some of those critical points that they were playing in a just a basic, clinic tournament. Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, and coaching is interesting too, because when you step onto the other side and are kind of teaching in that way,
Yeah,
not just teaching the hard skills, but teaching the kind of mental aspects.
yeah,
I was fortunate. I
the
taught for
mental
a number of
mapping.
years. Yeah, exactly. I taught for a number of years. There was a national training center at Princeton, and I used to teach there in the summer times, through the end of my sort of high school and early university undergrad days. And that was a wonderful experience. We would go down there for several weeks, and a lot of the lunatics that I mentioned earlier would be down there coaching, and so we would coach all week, and then we would go into Philadelphia, or we go into Manhattan for the weekend, and you just have a horrifying weekend. Like wake up on the street somewhere, and then like collect yourself and come back and like yeah, coach all week long and then do it again.
Great.
Yeah, yeah.
So tell me, what did it look like, as you moved through this phase of life and into university? Did you go on a squash scholarship somewhere, or did you then go and study architecture in school? Like what was that path?
Well, it was really interesting, and that was a kind of challenging moment in some ways, because I was 100% sure that I wanted to study architecture, and I was
Okay.
really excited about it. And I applied to a number of schools. I applied to, I think I applied to University of Toronto.
Yeah.
I think that might have been the only Canadian school that I had applied to. I was, I think, one of the top recruits at the time, and I was looking at going down to the States. I was being recruited at the time to Dartmouth, University of Pennsylvania, Princeton. It was great. I was being flown down to tour the campuses, and was accepted. I had great SATs, and I was accepted into the architecture programs. And then, and I'm still a little confused about it, but at the last moment, it all sort of fell through. And, the way I understood it was that because we were a middle class Canadian family, we didn't qualify for financial aid. And of course, the Ivy League schools didn't have sports scholarships. And at the same time, my parents hadn't, saved or prepared for the costs of an Ivy League education. And so it just felt like at the last minute, it all evaporated. And I still wonder if I had like really had more of an ability to have more agency, like would I have been able to make it happen through financial aid and these other things? But that was very much my what I was told at the time, that it just was off the table. And so my option for architecture at that point was U of T. And my other option that I was weighing it against was going to Western to play squash. And Western didn't have an architecture program, but it had really at that time, the only squash program in Canada,
Right.
which was led by Jack Ferris, who was just a legendary figure who coached at the school for many, many decades. And that was sort of the route that all Canadian squash players went.
I mean, they also had like an incredible just general athletics program across the board.
Yes.
The Mustangs were a strong football team. There's a good hockey team.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
all of it. Yeah.
Yeah. it was yeah, it was a sports oriented school, and it was a really tough decision for me because I really wanted to study architecture, and I was heartbroken that all these guys that I had grown up playing with, many of my friends were Americans, were so many of them were at these Ivy League schools, and going to Western allowed me to play in the NCAA league. And the challenge that I had with U of T was the School of Architecture was 3 blocks from where my high school was. And so I've been taking the subway down to the annex, which is a great neighborhood.
For 6 to 7 years. Yeah, you don't want to do that.
Yeah. And I just was like, I can't do it. I can't do it. And I had all these amazing travel experiences,
Right.
that I was talking about. And it just seemed soul crushing to stay in Toronto at the time. I actually found Western much more soul crushing, it turns out. And I really didn't enjoy my time.
I would not have expected you to say that. That was great.
Yeah, I remember I would be driving into London, Ontario, from the various tournaments that I would travel to constantly, and I would just get this like sinking feeling in my stomach. I really didn't enjoy it. And I was studying biology, which I was fascinated by. But it wasn't architecture. And so I was kind of a little bit lost. But I was playing and traveling, and the team was great. I mean, they were all guys that I had known for the most part since I was 10 or 11. And then you get all of these guys in a van, 9 people, 10 people, and you travel to, like 10-hour trips, 6-hour trips, spend so much time with these guys. And it was interesting. You had to have a really thick skin. There was like a lot of ribbing and a lot of, kind of hazing, and
of course.
Yeah. But it was amazing. And I'm still friends with, all those guys. I mean, so many of them still live out in Ontario. So, when I'm back there, I see a lot of them, and they're all characters, and I love them. And I feel so fortunate to have had those experiences. But I found my way eventually. I was kind of on a pre-med path, and then I took a research position one summer working at St. Mike's Hospital, the Department of Anesthesiology. And I'm really glad I did, because I thought this is amazing work. And it was an amazing position. I got to, do rounds. I got to sort of, sit through surgeries and do some experimental work. And I co-authored a research paper. And I came away from that thinking this is like an incredibly noble profession, and it's really fascinating, but it's not for me. And that was like, it was a hard decision in many ways, because, you see a path that's there.
Yeah.
And it's certainly a path that at the time, my family was endorsing, like, oh yeah, this is a great thing to do. And, and they would ask me, what do you really want to do? And I said, well, I would like to be an artist or an inventor. That was before I knew what an architect was. And they were like, this is ridiculous. Like, you got to pick something real.
Yeah. You have to do something that's going to make money.
Yeah. And of course, my mother grew up in Poland, in post-war Poland, and in an enormous hardship. And so her idea, like she would always say, when I'd say I wanted to be an artist or an inventor, she'd be like, that's ridiculous. Even if you're a great artist, you will die poor and only be known, for anything long after your death.
Right.
And so, in some ways, architecture, at least the way I'm endeavoring to practice and approach it, sits somewhere between artistry and invention. And
I'm sure we're gonna get there very shortly.
Yeah. So just to close the Western chapter, I ended up with a degree in genetics.
Okay.
And for me, the genetics was fascinating because you could visualize spatial relationships. You spent all your time in a lab, which I didn't love, and you were sort of looking at, the results of things that you would run on arrays and gels. Yeah. You would infer what was happening at a molecular level. And I love that visualization and the potential and the design aspect of, like, chemical interactions. And I had a minor or an area of concentration in philosophy. And those were the courses I loved,
back to philosophy again. Yeah.
Yeah. Like philosophy of quantum mechanics, philosophy of time travel. I was taking a lot of those classes and really, really loved them. And I came out of that whole process and just was so done with school. In many ways, I was kind of done with squash in that moment. And I had been working as a tree planter in the summers. And so I really just continued to do that. And I worked managing tree planting contracts and planting. Essentially, I worked my way across the country, in Ontario, Northern Ontario. And that was really an escape. And of course, like spending time in nature, like really spending time in nature, sleeping in a tent for weeks and weeks on end and working outside in the elements all day. And I worked sort of, from Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, and eventually found myself out on Vancouver Island, and started working in the forest industry there. And then, that sort of became a kind of full-time gig or an escape. I was doing a lot of contract work, and I bought a van, and I'd always had this obsession with surfing, which is very strange for a kid who grew up,
In Ontario.
in Ontario. And I spent the next 3 years more or less like living in my van and living in logging camps and small town motels.
And how old were you when you were doing this?
So I would have, at
Late
that
20s?
point, I graduated and I was 23.
Yeah.
Or I would have, graduated at 22. So,
Yeah.
from the time I was 22 until I started architecture school at 26, or 27. Yeah, 26. Yeah.
Wow. So while you're driving around Vancouver Island, you're driving up the coast of Vancouver, like.
Yeah, exactly. The most of the contracts I worked at that point were Vancouver Island in the early season and late season. So that
Yeah.
would have been, kind of March, April until, or maybe March, March, April, and then you would start some interior contracts kind of June, July, and then back again on the coast kind of late August, September into October. And the off season would really be kind of November, December, January, February. And so for the off seasons, I spent a winter living at Panorama, and snowboarded. And then I spent another winter down in Mexico, surfing, exploring Baja. And so it was this kind of cyclical thing for a couple of years, these really interesting adventures in the off season. And then, traveling throughout mostly Vancouver Island, but also through BC. And like I said, living on boats and barges and logging camps. It was a lot of heli logging, heli reforestation, I should say. And, we got into other things, chainsaw spacing, slash burning, really got to see, quite a range of aspects of silviculture and forest practice. And I was in heaven. I mean, the landscapes were stunning, flow planes, helicopters, going to these remote locations, getting dropped off on the edge of a mountainside by a helicopter, working all day, getting picked up at the end of the day.
Listening to Michael talk about being dropped off on a mountainside and having that deep appreciation for stunning, untouched landscapes really makes you think about how we craft our own outdoor living spaces. Imagine stepping into your backyard and feeling like you've walked out onto a private, sculpted beach, perfectly integrated into the natural environment with the mountains resting in the distance. That is exactly the kind of contextual design Aquanta Pools brings to life. You might not have mountains in your backyard, but with them utilizing innovative biodesign technology imported from Italy, Aquanta creates custom pools that seamlessly blend into your property's existing topography. What makes this system truly remarkable is the installation process. It requires significantly lighter excavation, meaning less disruption to your yard and crucial protection for the delicate root systems of your mature trees. Instead of fighting the land, they work with it, incorporating the natural stone and utilizing the existing tree canopy to shape the final aesthetic. Whether you have the space for a sprawling oasis or need a specialized swim spa for a tighter footprint, they customize the build entirely to your lifestyle. They also offer total flexibility with water sanitation, allowing you to choose from traditional chlorine or bromine to saltwater or advanced active oxygen or ozone systems for a crystal clear natural swim. Owner Yuri brings over 20 years of seasoned expertise from the European pool industry right here to Canada. If you've ever wondered why pool installations notoriously drag on, it is usually due to the weather delays or poor planning. Yuri's methods eliminates that entirely. His team creates a temporary protective shell around the pool and the build so that you can see uninterrupted progression daily. That means you hit your schedule, you hit your budget, and there are absolutely no hidden upcharges. If you want to work with a straightforward, reliable company that understands the importance of protecting your landscape and your timeline, Head over to the liner notes for more details on the Quanta pools, or you can email me directly, Jonathan at Issued for Construction. That's JONATHAN at issuedforconstruction.ca. Now, let's get back to Michael.
And again, for me, the kind of camaraderie of, having this tight crew.
Yeah, you're with a crew. Yeah.
People, living in tight quarters, going through these extreme experiences. And the people were all fascinating because so many of them were there as a means to something else. They had a dream, and they weren't afraid to work incredibly hard to save money. And so the people were really fascinating. Many of them were artists. Many of them were, ski bums, people who were, working seasonally to chase some other dream. Charlotte Gill, whom I worked with and who was part of the crew that I was on for a number of years on Vancouver Island, wrote an amazing book that was an account of tree planting called Eating Dirt. And, it was interesting. I got into planting through a friend of mine, who was a squash player, who I really looked up to, and he was doing it. And it was a great way to stay fit through the summer originally. I think at the time my parents looked at it as, in fact, I know they did because they would tell me that this is a waste of time. And I had so many life experiences through that in retrospect, really have set me up for, kind of what I do today in running an architecture practice and being an entrepreneur. The constitution that you had and the focus to go out and do something that was really hard, and took a lot of concentration for 8 or 10 hours a day.
Right.
And the kind of persistence mentally, physically, of course, but mentally, and then to get up day after day and do it and be undaunted. And, it was really something. Also, I got into the management side of things and I did a lot of project management. And so, to manage, 12, 18 people, and maybe that's why like a 20-person practice to me feels like the right size. It's a sort of size that I've been comfortable with for decades now. But
and also the timber element, right? We'll go there in a little bit, but
yeah, absolutely. And so, through that time, I mean, I was trying to think, I should go back and really calculate. I mean, I'm sure I must have planted myself at least 500,000 trees. And then, with the crews that I was running and managing, millions more. And it would be interesting. I'm actually headed up to Alert Bay, next week. And I haven't been back there really since I stopped doing that work. And I'm, looking at potentially getting involved in some projects up there. And
that's pretty circular. That's really special.
It's really special. And I'm, again, I was grateful for that time in my life and those experiences. And Alert Bay, the Up Island, is just such a kind of magical place. And so I'm really looking forward to going up there. I would love to go back to see some of these, cut blocks that we planted 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah. What do they look like? Yeah, with that growth. Oh,
yeah. So and again, those crews were also full of lunatics.
You'd have to be, I think, to be able to go and accept the fact that you're going to go into a helicopter, get dropped off in the middle of nowhere, and expect that you're going to get picked up again. Just because, that's what they're supposed to be doing.
And guys were getting into a lot of trouble. You would give them $1,000 cash advance for the day off, and then have to go pull them out of the drunk tank 2 days later, or and so it was fascinating. I mean, I got to again meet a cross section, of people, and there really were such a cast of characters, and some of them I'm still good friends with today. And that's something actually that I really cherish in my life, is that I've had, quite a few different chapters, over the years, over the kind of arc of my 52 years. And I have what I would consider to be close friends from every, single chapter. And sure, I don't see many of them as often as I would like, but I'm always amazed that, they just keep circling back into my life. And so there might, there was a guy that I worked with, and I hadn't seen him in 25 years. And, he was an amazing planter, total character. And, he worked on my crew. He also used to run crews. And it turns out he now has his own silviculture company. And I remember, going over to do some work on Denman Island a few years ago, when I really started to do like remote work through the Pacific Northwest. And I just saw, his truck on the ferry. It said Wagner Reforestation on it. And I got out of my truck and I walked over, and he was sitting there, and I looked down through the window, and he just turned over and he was like, "Oh, hey, Leckie." Like it had been a day since we last saw each other. How's it going? And I was like, hey, Wagner, how are you? And it's like, oh, good. Things are good. Slugging them in the ground, planting trees. It's going well. And it was just like such a funny experience. And so, and connected with other friends since then. And if there's something about, I think, the bonds that you form through life experiences that involve a certain kind of hardship, and again, this is like, when I say hardship, and then I think about the perspective that, my mother had growing up, like, this isn't,
Yeah, but everything is it's individual based. It's you never would have lived the life that your mom lived. You couldn't have. You were born when you were born. Like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So tell me. So you went and you at 26 you went to architecture school.
I did. Yeah. Yeah. So, I was accepted at UBC and U of T.
Okay.
And, I had this kind of same dilemma again. And, it was so funny. I remember, of course, still not knowing what architecture was. And it took me a while, even through architecture school, to really understand what architecture was, And there's this thing that, they talk about at school. And of course, we use the term now, like, that something is architectural. It takes you years to really understand what that means. And perhaps that meaning is even fluid in some ways, right? Depending on the practitioner that you'll talk to. But I remember trying to make that decision. And I remember going down to U of T, to the School of Architecture. And I thought, I at least, they had a new school at that point. And I thought I should go down there and take a look, and go to the school at UBC and take a look, and, really see how I feel about these experiences. And, at UBC, they had Patricia Packow was teaching at the time, and George Wagner, and I was really fortunate to study under both of them, and ultimately went to work with the Packows. And I was really inspired by their work in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember having a conversation with Detlef Mertens at U of T at the time, and I think he was the dean or director. And it was such a preposterous conversation from my end, because here I was, again, like, I had fallen out of step with the standard on a process. So I was a couple years older, and I remember at that time feeling kind of out of place in an urban environment. I had spent so much time living in the wilderness.
Yeah.
That I would come back to the city, and it was like, I for the first time in my life, I would be like, oh, I don't feel at home here. I feel strange. Like, most of my clothing, first of all, was like, it was gear. It wasn't really clothing. It was like
you're walking with cargo pants.
It was just like, big burly fleeces and rain gear. It was probably patched and torn. And like, you would walk down the street, and it was like, I just remember at some point, like, walking in, like, being downtown in Toronto, or in Vancouver, and you'd walk into a cafe and people would be sitting there in suits and, like, working in the finance industry. And I'd just be like, whoa, I'm like, this is like, I just felt really out of place. And plus, you'd have this massive truck that you couldn't park anywhere, and, or a van full of surfboards or whatever it was. And so I remember talking and asking the question, and saying, I remember this so clearly, and it was such a preposterous thing to say. And I said to Detlef Mertens, do you think there's a future in architecture?
I hope so.
That's more or less what he said. And then, continued to explain why, people will always need, buildings and the physical body and everything else. And I can't remember, the details of his answer, except that he was a firm believer that there was a future in architecture, in the profession. Anyway,
I mean, he had a couple hundred kids at the school that were going through a program collecting tuition from, and profs teaching it. He better hope that there was.
Yeah. He was invested. In there being a future in architecture. Absolutely. No, and I chose UBC, and I went to UBC, and it was an amazing experience. Again, I was one of the things I loved about UBC is there weren't co-op. Like, it wasn't a co-op program, so to speak, but
right.
there were studies abroad programs,
Right.
which I loved. And of course, I had that great experience in Madrid, and then, traveling, just generally speaking, tended to have a kind of nomadic tendency. And so I was fortunate to study in Italy and study in Athens and spend a summer working in Athens. I studied in Egypt.
Egypt.
And yeah.
What was that like?
There was an Athens Cairo studies abroad program.
Yeah.
And then was fortunate to be offered an opportunity to work as a student intern with the podcast, which was wonderful. And it was funny because even at that point, I still had no idea what architecture was, and I had just studied. I had done a second year studio with Patricia Packow, and I remember she gave me the lowest mark that would be the lowest mark on my entire architecture school transcript. And I worked so hard in that studio, so hard. And I thought I had produced something. I was, the vertical studios were like, years 2 through pre-thesis, so I was at the younger end, or the starting end of that spectrum.
Right.
And struggled. We all struggled in that studio. After she gave me my mark, I went to see her and I said, Patricia, this is such a low mark. Can you help me understand this? I really worked hard and I came up with a project. And she looked at me and I'll never forget this. And she said, Michael, I think you have so much potential as an architect, but you have to stop thinking and just do. You've got a real reluctance to make form. And that's really what this profession is all about, making form. And it was so true. I had spent the entire time, the program for that studio was the Seattle Public Library. And it was right around the time that OMA was doing that project. And it was a massive program, and I was crunching numbers and I was analyzing and I was diagramming. And I was so reluctant to actually make a building without somehow being convinced that the numbers were going to support the decisions. And, that was a time where I really had to shift, coming from a science background, from a left brain dominant way of thinking into a right brain dominant way of thinking. And she really, pointed that out very, very clearly for me, the difference between an analytic approach and a synthetic approach. And I really think that, great architecture combines both sides of the brain, and you have to really have both faculties. But it was funny because a couple of weeks after that, she then, asked me if I'd come in for an interview, and then was offered a job to work in the practice. So it was kind of a mind fuck.
Come stink it up at our place.
Yeah. Get
out of your own way.
Yeah, and that was an amazing opportunity. And I will say, the level of rigor at that practice, and the commitment, it was a very monastic environment, and the discipline and the focus, for me were just it's going to sound funny because I had no idea what I was doing there. And I was so junior, but I actually and I was so, I had just moved into this great new office space. And for me, it was the first time in forever that I could ever remember feeling like I was at home. I was so comfortable. I was oh, great. Everybody else is would love to draw this thing 100 times. And
also in a professional environment that you hadn't really felt comfortable in for a long time.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And architecture school is so destabilizing. It's so challenging, particularly coming from, philosophy and genetics and having all this keen interest in drawing and everything else. I mean, I remember when I started school, I was oh my God, this is what school could be. I get to make things and draw things. And sure, we, learn about building wall assemblies and things like that. But this is, I was this, where's this been all my life? This is amazing.
Yeah. Mom, guess what? I found it. Mom, yeah. I found it.
Yeah. And, it was funny because even right up until 2 weeks before I started architecture school, my mother was trying to convince me not to go. And at this point, she had been living in Europe for years.
Wow.
And I popped over to see her, and she worked in IT. And I remember she was, training for that when I was in elementary school. And she was, she incredibly smart. She's the kind of person that could do the Rubik's Cube with one hand, you know, but seeing her work ethic also, I think really informed mine. And, you know, it took a lot of willpower to be like, no, I'm doing this. I understand that, you know, you think it's a foolish and crazy decision, but this is what I really want to do.
Mhm.
And so I ended up taking time off after my second year. I took a leave of absence to work with the pack house. And that was, it was just such an amazing experience.
Well, it's interesting because you're saying this. When you go back to school, as I mean, at that point, I guess you could be defined as a more mature student, right?
Yeah.
You're going back, and now you're pursuing something that you are totally interested in. You don't feel like you've just kind of rushed from high school into making a decision as to what your major is going to be. This is like has become a more methodical decision as to what you want to do with advancing your career. So
Yeah.
taking a year off makes complete sense. Now you get to go and hone in on the skills.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, yes. And at the same time, I think, you know, I also had some lunatic tendencies from, you know, having spent the previous, you know, 8 years first, you know, in this environment of traveling with a band full of lunatics and being mentored by lunatics. And then also like living out
Working with lunatics.
yeah, in the bush, you know, and dealing with those extreme situations. But you know, it kind of provided a sort of resilience, you know, if nothing else, and certainly a kind of work ethic and a constitution and a focus and a discipline, which you know, are all things that I think are absolutely essential in the profession.
So what led you away from having the desire to work at a large scale studio to want to go out and pursue something for yourself?
Oh yeah, you know, that was interesting. You know, I loved working with the pack house. It was such a great experience. I learned so much, and you know, I worked there from 2005 until 2009.
Okay.
And you know, even during that time, I was doing kind of work in the margins. I was just so fascinated with making things, you know, and of course, as an intern, you could barely support yourself financially.
Yeah.
And, you know, I guess being industrious and kind of entrepreneurial, I was, you know, doing some work in the margins to help make ends meet. And I was fascinated with architectural visualization at the time. And so, you know, throughout school and then after, we would have professors who were doing competitions or, you know, other bits of professional work who would come to myself and my friends and ask us if, you know, if we would help with renderings and whatnot. And then that sort of, we started doing that work for developers. And then I started doing some kind of architectural work, you know, in the margins. I was just thirsty to really learn, you know,
Yeah.
and, you know, it was great because I started working in, you know, in the margins in projects that had a high degree of kind of customization where we were fabricating things. And so I started to develop relationships with fabricators, and also, you know, through the work that I was doing with the Patcos, you know, I really sort of understood that architecture on the, you know, in some ways is really about these like relationships with the collaborators. I mean, of course, you know, the practice of architecture involves a whole series of relationships, you know, the relationship is, you know, between and amongst the architect team, because I think, you know, architecture is rarely, if ever, you know, the creation of a single hand, you know, even at the level of an office. So there's the kind of relationship amongst the team. And one of the things that I really appreciated with the pack house was that there were people that had been at that practice for decades at that point. And you know, the synergy and the kind of almost sort of collective consciousness that develops from that degree of familiarity and that amount of time spent working together. But then there's also like the relationship between the architect and collaborators, you know, the consultants. Of course, the architect builder relationship, but deeper than that, like all of the sub trades, especially when you're trying to move the practice of architecture from one of curation to one of making and fabrication. You know, which is I think where so much of my interest lies. You know, and is challenging to do in the context of, you know, approvals, warranties, you know, building code, everything else. I think Tom Kundig talks a lot about this in his fascination with hot rod culture. But I also think, of course, there's the architect client relationship, which is really, really important for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. And then, just to go on a tangent a little bit, I think the architect and architectural photographer relationship is a really, really important one. And that was one that I, would witness with John Packow and Jimmy, that they had one photographer that always documented their work. And it was like an incredible process of patience and scouting and waiting for the right light. And of course, it was all, analog photography. And, when I was a junior, when I was a student intern at that practice, I spent a lot of time doing award submissions. And so working with the photographs and, one of the tasks that I had to do was I had to take the library of large format positives, I guess they were, or negatives.
Negative. Oh no, they would have been, if they were large format, they would have been positives, I believe.
Yeah. And like get those all scanned and digitized and color balance them, in this way that was just like incredibly meticulous.
Yeah. Sounds incredibly arduous.
Yeah.
I studied photography through like high school and into university. That was,
Yeah. And I studied some photography in high school, and I love photography, and I still do. I'm, an avid hobbyist photographer. And so I love doing that. But the process of the discipline of, working with those photos and then trying to color correct them and balance them. And, John would come over and say, "This is great, but, that one rock in the corner is like a little too bright. Can you tone that one down?" And I loved it. I mean, to me, I was like, yeah, of course. Like that's like that feels comfortable to me to be looking at things with that degree of intention. And now, we work primarily with Emma Peter. And the architect photographer relationship is such an interesting one because so much of the work of the architects, so much of architecture, particularly in the types of work that we do, which are, a lot of custom single family residential work or remote work, private work, let's say, the experience of that work to the larger community, is conveyed through the work of another artist. And I was talking about this recently, on a podcast, and of course Emma, texted me afterwards because I had said that, no matter how great the photograph is, architecture is such a multi-sensorial thing, such a multi-sensory experience that, even the best photograph will still fall short of the experience of the building.
Of course. Well, you're never gonna, you can't feel it in the same way necessarily. You can't.
Well, and yeah, you can't. It's true. And actually,
you're it, like all of it.
Yeah, we started talking about it a little bit, and I had to kind of rethink that a bit because, on the one hand, it's easy to take one or two great photographs of a building, almost any building in a way.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, but to understand like a work of architecture as a whole, and to understand and evaluate it, perhaps based on its weakest moments, like how resolved is it completely and fully? Like that's something that I don't think that you understand or experience through photographs. And that's where, when you go and see the work of great masters, and you understand the rigor and the resolution, that's where you really understand what excellence is. And I think that you need to see buildings and experience them, in the real world to fully appreciate that.
Yeah.
Now, I will also say that, photography is such an amazing medium, right? Like you can capture so much that, you could capture something in its best moment. In some ways is architectural photography, really nothing more than just like portraiture of a building. And when you think about great portraiture, like you can capture something of a person that is like that person's best self or that person's highest self or this moment or something in their smile that like portrays them in a certain light that, is poetic, is outstanding. And in some ways, like perhaps is a better version of that person than you might experience in real life.
Completely.
I actually, had to rethink my comments and maybe say that, a more authentic experience of a project happens by seeing it, by visiting it, and by being present.
The interesting one of the most interesting things I've had someone tell me so far that has like stuck with me throughout this entire podcast was a quote that Drew Mandel had said to me, and the difference between single family residential and anything that is, whether it's multi-res or commercial, institutional, the difference is that when you complete, the doors close on the project in single family. And in all the others, the doors open.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
And it has had a profound effect on when I have these conversations with people, because to your point, the photography is what allows people to be immersed in the project when the doors have now closed. And if you're doing anything on the institutional side, the civic side, public side, commercial side, whatever it is, those pictures are captured, but now people get to also experience all those other senses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So, okay. So you've at Pacow, you get involved in a lot of minutia, but you're also getting involved in these in the competitions. You're kind of seeing the practice on a small but also large scale, because now you're representative of the practice when you're submitting for competitions. So and you say you finished there in 2009.
Yes.
Okay, so 2009. What happens in 2009?
So 2009, I left Pacow and started practicing with a business partner, and we were doing some work down in Mexico, full circle down in Baja, where I had been spending time with
it was like a choose your own adventure, and you go back to that page. You're like, no, I want a different experience than when I turn the page.
Well, it is fascinating because when I was down in Mexico, I was doing a couple things. I was like resetting. I was pursuing this kind of dream of surfing. I loved, traveling, adventuring. And again, this was all, pre-cell phones. So it was like you had maps and manuals, and, this kind of iconic book called the Baja Book, which, would tell you to drive down this dirt road and turn left at the big rock and go over the rise, and, don't surf there because there's sharks and whatever else. And it was really fantastic. And I had deferred that trip a year, and that was the year that I spent at Panorama, because I was waiting for a childhood friend of mine to come on that trip with me, and he had broken his ankle snowboarding, and then the next year he decided to go back to school.
Okay,
and so I decided to go on the trip by myself, and it was a kind of like a bit of a seeking sort of journey in many ways. I was like really trying to understand what I was going to do at that juncture. Would I go back to architecture, or would I go to architecture school, not back to architecture school?
Right.
Finally, and kind of pursue this dream. I was very fascinated with industrial design as well. I had taken some courses, or been taking some courses at Emily Carr. And, I, at the time, was fascinated with meditation. And for me, it was part of the reason why I was okay to go by myself, is I was looking to get really deep into this kind of aspect of meditation in nature, in a remote landscape. And so I had just read Robert Monroe's Journeys Out of the Body, which is a fantastic book, and really opened my eyes to many things. And so this journey was as much about a kind of, soul searching, kind of metaphysical experiment as it was anything else. And I remember when I was down there and sort of living on the beach and surfing and fishing and foraging for firewood. I mean, I had this funny realization, and it was like, I got down there, and of course it was like November when I was down there, and I met some Canadians who were traveling, a couple, and some guys from Salt Spring, and they were all traveling in vans, and our paths kept crossing, and we formed this kind of loose caravan.
Salt Spring are a bunch of lunatics too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. In the best way possible. And I just remember being down there and loving this life, but feeling like I needed purpose. like I love the idea that I can surf at dawn and do this and that. But I was like, I was kind of, I was restless, and I was
Okay.
like, God, it would be amazing to be here, but I need a purpose, because this isn't enough. There's not enough meaning right now. And so, yeah, fast forward, 2009, I was back down there. We did 3 projects out in the East Cape, and one sort of, kind of between San Jose del Cabo and Cabo San Lucas. And I really love that work. I love spending time down there. But after a
This was design, or you built
design architecture.
design. Okay.
And at that time, I wasn't yet registered, and you know, after several years, it was 5 years of trying to make a go of it. I just felt like, the practice wasn't going anywhere, and the partnership was really strained. And so I made the decision to start my own practice. And it was right around the time that I had completed my requirements for architectural registration.
Okay.
Which was great, because this whole idea of the use of the term of the word architect, is appropriately controlled,
Guarded.
and guarded.
Yeah.
It carries an enormous amount of responsibility and
Yep.
kind of weight, not just legally, but I think kind of culturally, and professionally. And, so at that point I would have been 42 years old, just getting registered as an architect. And, it had been over 10 years since I had graduated school. And so, receiving a modest amount of recognition, people would be writing things, and they would, describe me as an architect. And then the AIBC would come after me and say, you said you were an architect. And I said, I didn't say I was an architect.
They did.
So, yeah, so scarred by it that it was like one of the, habits I had of introducing myself and to be like, I am not an architect, at the start of every client meeting, which was challenging when you're trying to chase down work. So eventually I got through that process finally. And that was when I launched Leckie Studio. So that was in 2015. And so we just celebrated our 10th anniversary.
Pretty special.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, 10 years I think in this industry is considered like a grace period, in many ways, like a kind of warm up period.
Yeah.
It's not easy to start a practice. And, opportunity is really the hardest thing. How do you
get work?
Find the opportunity how do you find work?
So let me ask that question on that topic. So you leave Baja, right? How do you decide? One, how do you decide where you're going to land between BC and Ontario? Was your family still in Ontario, or had they left already?
My father had moved to a small town outside of Ottawa, Iroquois.
Okay.
My sister was living in Montreal at the time. She was going to school at McGill.
Okay.
So there was nothing tying me to Toronto.
Okay. So back to BC.
Yeah. So I came back to BC, and I loved the West Coast, and I loved the life that I had, sort of cobbled together here. And interestingly, in the way that life just keeps folding back on itself, at the start of the pandemic, I bought a house in Tofino. So that was 2020. And I had a relationship with Tofino on and off for the last 20 years. I used to, go there between contracts, with a van full of surfboards, and live in my van as many people did, and many people still do. It's a challenging place to live and work in many ways. And the house that I bought is like 150 yards from where I used to park my van and sleep in my van.
Crazy.
Which was down
by coincidence?
I think by coincidence. I mean, it's I had been looking around for a recreational property, and obviously still had this love of surfing, and was contemplating Gulf Islands because they're so close. And then was in Tofino for work, and just happened to drive by, like right at the start of the pandemic. Just drove by this one house and looked at it, and I was like, there's something that just. And I'm sure I driven by this house a million times, and I saw the for sale sign, and I looked at it and arranged a showing. Again, it was weird because it was the start of the pandemic, when there was no toilet paper on the shelves, and everybody was, really freaking out, and everything was shut down, and they were taking all the basketball hoops off the backboards, at schools and playgrounds here. And I just had this feeling. I was like, yeah, like without a doubt, like this is the place. And so that's, we can talk about that more in a minute, but it is funny to think how life is continually, folds back on itself in a way, or reverberates.
If you allow it to.
If you allow it to, yeah. And on the one hand, like I would say, I have friends guys that I knew in elementary school that I maintained friendships with. They all went to high school together. They still live in Toronto,
right.
Or north, just outside of Toronto. And there's a really tight series of reverberations. Like I traveled far and wide, and yet these reverberations kind of keep, circling back, and it's really, really fascinating. But I love living in the Pacific Northwest. I love it so much.
What was what was the first project that you acquired on your own independent practice?
And it was sort of a transition out of that other practice into my practice.
Yeah.
And the first two projects would have been, there was a house in Portland,
Okay.
called Ridge House, which will be the first project that's going to be shown in the monograph that we're making, which I'm really excited about. It's a modest monograph. We're using a small publishing house in Switzerland. And
what no one's seeing right now, by the way, is as Michael's describing this, there's a small little grin across his face, because you're realizing that this monograph is going to get created, and it's like you're getting your work, it's embodying your work, and what a joy that this, again, recognition of having a body of work that can go into a book.
Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, it's exciting, and I know, admittedly, I'm a little bit conflicted because it feels indulgent. I mean, at times it feels like there's a certain degree of vanity to it. Like, who would want to read this book? I mean, we certainly didn't pick this publisher for their distribution. We picked them because they just have such an amazing sense of craft. And so in many ways, it's a project for the practice. An object to give to clients, and more just a marker of where we're at right now.
Yeah.
And like I say, it's quite a modest, book. But I'm really, really excited about it. I was just in Switzerland, meeting with the designer and the publisher, and you start these relationships, and you haven't met in person, and I think we were all a little bit like, okay, how do we do this? Because it is so personal. And then having been over there and spent time with them, like they're absolutely the right team for this book. And so that's really, really, really encouraging. So there was this project in Portland, Ridge House. And then there was another project. There was an interiors project, and it was Slack, the Vancouver offices for Slack, the tech company.
Okay.
And at that time they were so small. They were just starting out, and they were just hitting this huge moment of scale. And so, I met with Stuart Butterfield at the time. And the brief was preposterous. He said, I just signed this lease. It's a 5,000 square foot, top floor of a heritage building in Yaletown. And, we're growing like crazy. Right now we've got, 12 guys in a really small space. And we expect to be, growing. We want the space to be able to accommodate 40 people, or 45 people. And I need it to be designed, permitted, built, bums in seats in 90 days, which, was next to impossible. And I know he was interviewing a number of architects, and, remember at this point, this tech company was
nothing, 12 people.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Stuart was friends, or I think actually boarding school roommates with a good friend of mine. And that was where the connection came from. And maybe, I don't even know, maybe I was the only one that was naive enough to say yes to that set of constraints. And I called a guy who was a builder, Patrick Powers, who's since built many of our projects. And as a good friend of mine, and we had just been looking for an opportunity to work together. And I said, look, would you entertain this? We could do it as a design build exercise. And so we set about doing it. I said to the Slack team, like, we're going to need incredibly tight turnarounds on all the sign-offs. And the only way we're going to get this done, and this goes back to the relationship idea, is like, we can't order things that are going to have long lead times. It takes 12 weeks to get something. We're already late. We've blown the deadline.
Yeah.
So we're gonna get this permitted really, really quickly, and we're gonna call on all our entire network of makers to fabricate things. And of course, that was they loved that. Stuart in particular loved it. So all the glazing partition systems were custom made out of steel angle, and we got it done. And of course, a month into it, they signed the lease for the floor below. I said, now it's twice as big and just as much urgency. And then 30 days later, they signed the lease for the floor below that.
No way.
Later, they signed the lease for the basement floor. And then the project grew and evolved. And so, then we ended up, tearing open a huge hole in the floor to create this interconnected floor space. And
staircase.
It ended up being a 2.5-year project, but it was an incredible sprint.
Started with 90 days.
Yeah, and we had people in the space, working after 90 days or 100 days. And there were some long tail items that had to come in, and it was an incredibly hectic kind of evolving kind of project. But the reason that project was interesting was because that core team that was starting out would all come to me because I got to know them when they were really small, and they said, "Oh, we love this space so much. If this company makes it, I want you to design a house for me." And sure enough, they did incredibly well. And sure enough,
you've designed a couple houses.
Who said, I love what you're doing here. I love coming to work every day in this space. Became our next wave of residential clients.
Unbelievable. What a cool, again, there it is again,
Yeah.
It's I feel like it's like the, you're on like an island, and there's a current that keeps coming around the island.
Yeah.
Giving you another wave to ride.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating, and I'm so grateful for those opportunities. It's the opportunities to do houses for the people that were in part of the founding team.
Yeah,
and they're all remarkable individuals. And so many of the houses that have been award-winning houses, are those people. And many of them are friends of mine, which is also so special.
Snowboard together, or surf together, bike together, hike together.
Spend time together, some snowboarding, not so much surfing, although that might happen. Spending time in Tofino, we swap houses. Yeah, just, shared interest, hi-fi, music, records, definitely a common interest amongst a number of them. The two things that I got really interested in during the pandemic, the two hobbies, my pandemic hobbies, were hi-fi and cocktails, sort of like running your own speakeasy.
Have you seen the highest paid bartender in Japan? This gentleman that uses almost like a katana to craft the ice. Have you seen it? Yes. Seen this guy? Yeah.
Yes. Japanese culture around both hi-fi and cocktails.
Yeah.
That's a rabbit hole that you can go down.
Yeah.
And I love Japan for that reason, not to mention the amazing snowboarding there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me, you're at a stage where when you started your practice, it was you referenced earlier in our discussion that the right size is 20. What did it look like as you took on more people, as the evolution of the practice grew, both from a project quantity standpoint, but also from a project quality standpoint? You can't be involved in everything with the minutia, so you need to bring in people. And so what did the evolution of hiring look like? What were some of the first roles that you brought in as the founder of the practice?
Yeah, it's, hiring when you're starting a practice is challenging because you have, sort of no reputation
Yeah.
whatsoever. And you're trying to hire great people and, you're trying to convince them that it's a good idea to come and work with you. And, it was originally just it started as a small team, mostly of student interns.
Okay.
Um, and I was fortunate to have a couple great hires early on, people that have been with me, now for 10 years and close to 10 years. And, it's interesting as we're talking, it seems to me that one of the themes that's, coming through for me is, this idea of relationships and building relationships, which I think is absolutely critical to, the practice, but also life. And, you know, I've been really, I've started to think a lot about succession. Um,
I was gonna ask you the question, but I'm glad you went there.
yeah, yeah. And not because, I'm like at all thinking about retirement,
Yeah.
in any way, shape, or form. I mean, this is one of the things about architecture that, everybody knows. It's such a long road to achieve any kind of mastery and such a slow process, to build a practice and to find opportunities. And I remember, shortly before I left the pack house, I had said to John, and that practice would have been 35 years old at that point. And I had said to John, John, it must, I think there was some recognition, something that I had probably submitted and they had, won an award. And I said, John, it must feel good, to have this recognition. And John is interesting because, he was completely unfazed by any of the recognition, which I really, appreciate and admire. It was sort of like, okay, well, but we're trying to do this, and in a way, the recognition is kind of funny because, people are recognizing things that you were doing 4 or 5 years ago, in practice. And so you're so far beyond it in terms of what you're already doing. And,
Taking the band-aid off of an old wound.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And you're like, and it's like, okay, great. Yeah. Thank you. And then you're
I've
like,
matured since then.
yeah, your head's entirely somewhere else. And, like if you're not growing and evolving at a rate that you're not at least maybe a little bit embarrassed of what you were doing 2 or 3 years ago, I would argue that you're not growing enough. So there's that aspect of it. People
Yeah.
are celebrating work that you're like, oh, if you could only see what we're doing now,
Right.
like, thank you. That's great. But also I'm kind of cringing a little. And, John said to me, his response was, Michael, I'm only just starting to do the work that I set out to do 40 years ago, just starting, and I was like, wow, and I can certainly appreciate that. We've been able to, accomplish a little bit over the last 10 years, but it goes so slowly. And, as you learn more and your aspiration grows and your opportunities grow, if you had asked me 10 years ago, how I would feel about where the practice is at now, I would be ecstatic. And yet, I look at it now and my ambition is so much higher. I really feel like we're just starting. We're just scratching the surface of what we can
Well, I
possibly
mean,
do.
you've entered a realm that I like in many ways. It's a couple years before I get there, but everyone that I've spoken to, everyone more or less has said anyone that's there that when you're in your 50s, you are totally on stride.
Mm,
It is the period of time in your life where you have arrived to who you are and your best work is now. It's present. It's happening because you've
that, yeah.
learned from everything leading up to that point. And you still have the energy and the spry to be able to go at it. So it
Yeah,
makes
you know what? I would agree with that. It's funny. I say this to my girlfriend, Sarah, who's like just the most wonderful human being, in all seriousness that like, she's getting the best version of me to date. And I say that jokingly, but also seriously because, not only professionally it's amazing to have, been working in a disciplined manner at something for a really long period of time, and start to feel that, you might actually have something to contribute. There might actually be a voice that like you're learning, and you're developing competency, but then also as a human being, as a leader, as a father, as a partner, as an architect, as a creator, as a person, to have invested time in growth and, evolving myself and trying to be a better human being. I really think a lot about this aspect of, what does it take to be a great architect? What would it take to be a great architect? Like a Khan, or, some of the architects that, that I admire of past generations.
Have you figured out that answer?
I haven't, but I will tell you this. Like, I think
I,
there's something that I think I think, be in some ways an extraordinary person. And I also think, like, you have to be optimistic, and you have to be hopeful, and you have to, like, want to create things that matter, of substance, of permanence. I mean, all architecture and design is a form of speculation. And, we have a vision, that is serving a set of circumstances, a group of stakeholders, a family, but you're bringing something into reality that doesn't exist. And that thing that you're bringing, that you're creating, that place that you're making, shapes the lives of people. And in doing so, you're actually saying, like, this is my vision for a possible future. And so, like, that's an enormous privilege and an enormous responsibility at any scale, at the scale of a giant master plan, or an airport, or or at the scale of a single family home, or at the scale of a bus shelter, and so I think you have to be an empathetic person on some level, I think, to create great architecture. And you have to think a lot about the human condition, because I think you're doing more than just creating buildings. You have to think about it at a much deeper level. And I think every architect that, that creates ambitious work, is in some way empathetic, work that has meaning, that resonates, with people, with a broader population. But I would also say that, all the architects that I really deeply admire are in some way mystics, that they're actually trying to create work that says something on a much more existential level, that says something about not just finding a place for the physical body for social interaction, which is absolutely fundamental and kind of critical. And, you could say that architecture is a political act as well, but also, like, at an existential level, like finding our place in the cosmos, in the universe, and what it means to exist. I think that the more I understand the profession of architecture, the more I understand how important that piece is.
well, so I want to bring that up because you and I spoke before, and you talked about this amazing initiative that you've been undertaking about trying to make prefabricated, off the grid style cabin.
Yes.
And I felt like this is a kind of a great way of encapsulating what your career has been, to be able to bring something like this forward, to provide people with an opportunity to have shelter at a somewhat of a reasonable cost. So can you talk a little bit about this as we kind of work towards a wrap up on, like, how you have evolved as a person?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Backcountry Hut Company was started by a childhood friend and myself, and we both share a passion for the outdoors. And he'd come to me originally and said, I've been involved in these remote builds, these community buildings, and they always go the same way. We have a group of people. It's a grassroots movement. They want to create an outdoor structure, a backcountry cabin, a skiing cabin, hiking cabin. And the process is broken. At the end of it, we end up with something that took way longer, cost way more, and is somehow ill-fitted. And I gave a talk recently for the AIBC for the fall lecture series that was called "A Camel is a Horse Designed by a Committee." And it was about this idea. It was a sort of starting point to talk about user participation in architecture and design. And, I've invested through the practice kind of 10 years into this notion of user participation in design and engaging in the built environment. And we started first with the backcountry hut company. How can we invite people to be part of the process, and how can we support them to create successful outcomes in small scale architecture? And then we've since moved this into the urban setting, and we're looking at building our first urban prototypes of what I would call component based architecture. So it's a kit of parts approach to small scale structures. So they're scalable, they're customizable, and the system arrives, flat packed on a truck and can be assembled by volunteers. Obviously, the more skill people have, the easier it is. And so we've delivered over 100 kits throughout North America. And it's a project that on the one hand, I feel incredibly good about. On the other hand, it's been challenging for me because, as my therapist has said, if you are inviting people in to co-create architecture, you have to be willing to live with the results. And so, a lot of times people will take the kits and they'll finish the interiors themselves. And, some of the interiors are outstanding and they're amazing. And some of them are challenging.
Challenging for you to accept. Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah.
I would imagine you're giving people that ability to go and create something themselves.
Yeah, it's like watching someone bully your kids on the playground. You're just like, oh my God, how could you be doing this? I love this thing so much. What have you done? And we've been working really hard at it, and it's not an easy thing to do. But these component-based systems, for years it was an expensive hobby, and we've got a team. We're starting to scale, which is really, really exciting. And as we finished our first couple, urban prototypes under a separate company called hideouts, because it's a very different process and set of constraints to build in an urban environment versus building in a rural environment.
Right.
I'm really optimistic. Just how this fits into the way that the whole design and construction industry is moving. And so we've been doing this work for quite some time, and it's been incredibly rewarding. And we do manufacturing on Vancouver Island, and we ship all over North America. And it feels like a process, and in many ways, the architecture practice as well. Like, I feel like my own identity, really comes through in the values and the work, and I feel very fortunate to be able to do this work that I love so much.
Okay, so my last few questions. I'm cognizant of our time, and that is there a place in this world that you would love to have a design of yours sit upon? Is there an island, a country? Is there some place that you wish you could say, I've got a hand on that?
It's funny. I don't know that I've ever thought about that. I do think about the idea of I have yet to build my own house. And I do have ideas for that. But they're more about contextual ideas, like I love spending time in the forest in the Pacific Northwest. I love being in Tofino. And I would love to build a house there. I'd love to build a house in the desert. And I think about, what the sort of contextual response would be, again, kind of to work without a client or to work, in this, kind of self-initiated way. The idea of self-initiated projects is definitely something that I'm moving more towards.
Okay.
And, we've been fortunate to work in a number of environments. We had a client install a backcountry hut at Fogo Island recently. And I haven't been out to see it. I only have experienced it through photographs.
Okay.
And it's turned out, really, really well. I would say more so than, having an aspiration to build in a particular place. I'm really interested in how to find particular kinds of clients, that will provide the opportunities for us to do work for them, and provide the service that we love to do. So certain private clients that will have an ambition for a kind of project.
Hmm.
Lantern House, which has been receiving a lot of recognition recently, was an exceptional client. And through that ambition, we were able to create, I think, something extraordinary. I'm really keen, because of all the work that we've done in remote locations and, the success with these remote systems. I'm keen to work with First Nations and Indigenous groups to be able to bring those skills, to some of those communities.
Yeah.
And currently sort of trying to explore some of those potential opportunities. For me, that would be a tremendous honor. I love, again, spending time in Tofino. We've got a project there, the Tofino Fish Pier, which is a kind of at the nexus of industrial adaptive reuse and kind of reconciliation driven project. So for me, it's really about the why more so than the where.
Fair.
This is how I would answer that.
Okay. And is there a piece of architecture in the world or a place that you have not yet visited that you have longed to be able to go see and experience?
Oh, so many.
Okay.
I mean, so many. I love to travel. And I love to travel to see architecture, sort of fanatically. And I love to travel to see modern architecture. I love to see ancient architecture. And I love to go to sites that, are of, a kind of ancient significance where maybe their means of construction or their meaning has yet to be, completely understood. Like, to me, that's incredibly fascinating. And I do believe that there's been, so much lost knowledge, through the modern era. So, I will continue to travel avidly. And, and I actually couldn't name one particular place, but
That's fair.
yeah. The list is huge.
Well, I've got to say, so, in saying all of this, if you want to, as you've been listening to this, you want to experience some of the photography of Michael and his studio, you can head to the Behind the Build Instagram page, and you can additionally go straight to their own. They'll feature some of their work on ours, and all of their work on his. Michael, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for spending this time with me. I've really enjoyed it. I didn't know that you were a squash player. I did know that you like to surf. So maybe when time permits, you can teach me something on a squash court about my insignificance on the court.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to connect. I really enjoyed the conversation, and it's wonderful to be able to talk on a personal level, a little vulnerable as well. But
yeah,
I really appreciate you holding space for this conversation and the work that you're doing with this podcast.
I appreciate it.